Hey guys, my name is Weston Gleave. I'm actually going through my CFI right now, and so my instructor instructed me to do some home lessons and see where I'm at with time and how I'm doing as far as my flow goes. So I decided I would record these and post them up on the internet and just get feedback from people that are a lot more experienced than I am, just to kind of see if I'm explaining things correctly, and also to just get some feedback, some evaluations, maybe some critiques on what I could change. So I've kind of already prepped the board, so we're going to talk about aerodynamics of flight. I'm teaching it based off of the school syllabus that hopefully I'll be working for. As we all know, that's kind of the plan. And also out of the most current publication from the FAA, so the Helicopter Flying Handbook. So a lot of old reference material that I was using was out of the Rotorcraft Flying Handbook, but since the new one is the Helicopter Flying Handbook, that's what we'll be using. So the basis for this, so the basis for this lesson is for the student, or you, or however you want to look at it, to gain a better understanding of how the helicopter flies. It's not just some form of magic that makes everything work. There's actually some science to it, funny enough. So what we're going to be covering is the four forces of flight: airfoils, relative wind, angle of attack, induced flow, the torque effect, translating tendency, pendular action, coning, gyroscopic procession, blade flapping, the symmetry of lift. We'll also be going over retreating blade stall, and I believe that is the last one we'll be doing. Oh, I apologize. We'll also be going over, oh no, that is it. Yep, retreating blade stall will be the last thing we talk about, the aerodynamics of flight. So let's get rolling into it. So first, let's talk about the four principles of flight, as far as aerodynamically we go. So you've got lift, weight, drag, and thrust. Lift is the upward force created by the airfoil. Created by the airfoil. Or as in the book it says, the lift is the opposes the downward force of weight is produced by the dynamic effect of air acting on the airfoil. So you can put that up there as well. I'm trying to decide which way to go on that, so you can kind of leave some comments for that. Weight is obviously, bad word to use, is the combined weight of the helicopter fuel and crew that gravity is acting on. So I guess to sum it up, the downward force caused by gravity. Alright. Drag is going to be the retarding force due to the resistance to the movement through the air. So things that are going to cause drag are obviously the fuselage, there's going to be drag on the rotor system, there's lots of things, and we're going to go into that. So airflow. And thrust is the force that propels the helicopter through the air. So your rotor system is what's going to produce your thrust. Your up and forward, side to side, back, as well as your tail rotor creates thrust, or your anti-torque system. So Okay. So that goes over, that's the basics and the definitions of the four forces acting on the helicopter. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to stick in each category and kind of go over how they're all working. So first we're going to stick with lift, and we're going to describe how lift actually is happening. For me, I like to erase the things that I've done so that we're not sticking them up on the board still. So, lift. How does lift happen? Well, there's two, you could say, principles or laws that are acting on the airfoil, and we're going to go into what an airfoil actually is. But so you've got Bernoulli's principle. We're just going to call him BP, and it basically states that the velocity of a streamline flow of air increases. Oh, I'm sorry, that's wrong. So Bernoulli's principle states that as a flow of air is increased in velocity, its density has to decrease. And for this, a lot of people use like the Venturi Effect, which is they list in the book. That's on in chapter 2, page 2-3. It shows you, let me write this definition here, but so. So this is made kind of prevalent with when you're looking at the Venturi diagram. Is the other way to explain it would be as a hose. You've got a hose that you're trying to spray the edge of your corner of your yard, and you know the pressure that's coming out may not be quite enough. But so what you do is you take your thumb and you pinch it over the top. Now what that's doing is it's constricting the flow of water, and since the same amount of water is trying to come out of the hose, it has to speed up to get out of that. But at the same time, it has to decrease the density of that water. So if you were looking at air, it's the same idea. An air hose, with a big open valve just kind of lets the air out, but when you constrict it, the air speeds up, and that's why those little blowguns work, like in shops. It's because you're constricting the air, so therefore it has to speed up to get all that same amount of airflow through the opening at the same time. But therefore its density has to go down because something's got to give. So next, you want to talk about Newton's third law. And it states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Excuse my handwriting, it's a little hard to write on this wiggly board, but getting the job done. So, for this, it's kind of self-explanatory. So, if you push something down, something's got to go up in its place. So, for us, this is made prevalent by when you are riding in your car when you were a kid. You might still do this, I still do, just because it's fun. But you stick your hand out the window and it's perfectly flat, and then you turn your hand back, or change the pitch of your hand if you want to go that far, and your hand shoots up in the air because you're now deflecting the air that's coming at your hand and downwards, and that is going to force your hand to go up. So that's Newton's third law. Now, me and an instructor at my flight school were talking about this, and he's read a bunch of publications that say that Bernoulli's principle is what gives you most of your lift, and where Newton's third law is very low. And I think that's actually what the helicopter flying handbook says, but he also read an article from NASA discussing that they were equal to each other, because a lot of people argue, and this is just for, you know, fun fact for you, that I mean, an F-18 can fly upside down perfectly straight and level with almost zero pitch on its elevators. So, you know, there's argument either way. So, but for now, we'll just keep it that Bernoulli's principle provides most of the lift, while Newton's third law provides a portion of the lift. And for me, when explaining this, I like to use the garden hose or the air compressor, and then, like I said, Newton's third law, you could describe it as your hand out the window, you change the pitch of your hand, and your hand climbs. So, now I mentioned airfoils, and the reason why I bring that up is because it's helpful when looking at the Venturi model when we were talking about lift. I'm going to erase the board here and kind of draw that Venturi so you can see what I'm saying. As let's say you've got excuse my artistry skills. You've got air or water, whatever you want to use, but we'll use air because we're flying, we're not swimming. You've got it in here, and so when it hits the Venturi, it constricts. So therefore, it's got to speed up. It's got to go, you know, twice as fast to get that same volume of air through. But also, like we said, it's got to reduce its density, so, or create a low pressure. So you could say that, you know, right here is low pressure but high velocity. And the reason why I draw the Venturi up on the board is because when we move on to the next subject, when we're talking about airfoils, is when you look at a Venturi, if you were just to cut this off, you've already kind of gotten an airfoil right here. So this kind of leads you into your next subject to describe how this works on an airfoil. So if we leave that there, erase the board, just leave that airfoil there, you can go straight into airfoils. So airfoils. They're described as any object that creates a useful reaction of lift. Like we brought up, a hand. I mean, that could be an airfoil. A ball could be an airfoil. A block of wood can be an airfoil. But when you're talking about efficiency, that's when things are going to start to change. For all intents and purposes, we'll use a generic airfoil or a non-symmetrical or symmetrical airfoil. Well, excuse me. I don't want to say that I'm gonna skip over something, but I'm gonna cover something real fast, which is also the Magnus Effect. This for me was really easy to grasp, but for explaining it, I'm gonna use a reference that I know of where this is actually applying. The Magnus Effect basically happens when you take a sphere or a ball and put a backspin on it versus where it's traveling. So if you have a ball and you rotate it this way, you know, so a backspin, so for us we'll say it's clockwise, but air travel is going this way. It creates lift by creating a high and low pressure system, or, you know, a high pressure underneath and a low pressure above. This was prevalent for me in water polo because it... So now that we've talked about Magnus Flow, and we brought up how when you put a backspin on a ball, it creates lift because it creates a high pressure on the bottom and a low pressure on top. And we remember when you've got low pressure, the air speeds up, and so therefore you're creating lift. And then we're going to talk about non-symmetrical and symmetrical airfoils, and we're also going to draw the parts on these as well. So you've got a chord line that runs from the leading edge to the trailing edge. And then you've got upper and lower cambers. The reason why I bring these up side by side is so that you can see the difference in between them, and this is what we're going to lead into and talk about how the benefits and the downsides of each airfoil. So on a symmetrical airfoil, like ones that's on like the R22, the R44, the Bell 206 on the main rotor, on most helicopters actually, is the reason why that is because one, they're more stable, because you've got an equal upper and lower camber. So this makes it so the center of pressure on the airfoil doesn't move around a lot. Whereas on a non-symmetrical airfoil it does, because as you can see, you're going to create a bigger high and low pressure on this because of the distance it's got to travel. Whereas on here, not so much. Now, that brings you into the disadvantages and the advantages of the other. So with the disadvantage with the symmetrical airfoil is it doesn't produce as much lift, whereas a non-symmetrical does. That's why your tail rotors are designed like this, because they're a lot smaller, so they need to produce a lot more lift per a given space.
Oh, I was like, you should record this.
You should record this, that would be great. So, if you were to write these down as pros and cons, creates more lift, per given chord length. So, right here, so if these are the same, you would get more lift out of a non-symmetrical. The cons of it is it's unstable, which means it needs to, there's constant need for a aerodynamic factor to come into play, basically, which is compensated for, but blade flapping, but we'll go into that later. So, pros of symmetrical and cons. You're more stable. Cons, less lift. So, when we go back to this, we should be able to list some pros and cons where these designs are used so that we have a better understanding. So when we quiz the end of this, we'll go back over this. Next, we're going to talk about relative wind. relative wind is described as the direction of the airflow encountered by the airfoil. So, and by that, what we're talking about is if you've got an airfoil and it's traveling this direction, relative wind is acting straight in the opposite direction. So you can look at this as this is what it may look like straight and level when you're just about ready to pick up from a hover or from the ground into a hover. So the blade itself is just traveling in the same axis of rotation and not flapping up or flapping down. And we'll go further into that, but you need to understand this because this is what's called, this is relative wind. And then we're going to get into, or I'm sorry, this is rotational relative wind, or in all intents and purposes, when you're talking about once it starts to rotate. So, angle of attack comes into play because angle of attack is the angle between the chord line and relative wind. So, chord line and relative wind. So for this, we're going to draw the basic airfoil and how it all works. So if you've got an airfoil, I'm going to do this in separate colors. I'm going to use orange as our chord line so we can see it. Blue is our rotational relative wind, or relative wind for this example. So when we say the angle between the chord line and relative wind, we're talking about this little angle right here. So let's say it's 10 degrees. That's angle of attack, or AOA is what it's called. So now this is going to change per the direction that the airfoil is traveling. So for this example, we're saying that it's traveling on the horizon, if that's how you want to look at it. It's the same all the way around the rotor disc. Angle of attack would obviously change if the blade was traveling in more or less, you know, this direction. Let me see. So if the airflow was traveling like this instead of flat like that, you're going to get almost no angle of attack per the pitch that you're at, because now you've got your relative wind coming in like that. So now your angle of attack is shrunk. And this comes into play when we start talking about blade flapping, so that's why I bring it up. And we're going to go further into that here in just a bit. So, subject in aerodynamics. We're actually not going to move on. We're actually going to backtrack to drag, because that's the next most prevalent thing that's ever changing, just like your angle of attack and how much lift you're creating. Whereas thrust and weight stay fairly consistent. They're just moving in their ways that they're affecting on the helicopter. So with drag, there's three types. You've got profile, induced, and parasite. Now, profile drag is the sum of all of form drag and skin friction combined. Now, form drag, we're talking about the shape of the airfoil. So when we bring up, if you're looking in the book and you're looking on page 2-5 in the Helicopter Flying Handbook, you'll see a diagram that's showing form drag. So you can look at it as, a block of wood trying to pass through the air. It has a ton of resistance because the air's got to hit it and then go around it, and it doesn't really create any useful lift. Whereas now you have a ball or a sphere, and it creates some lift because it's more streamlined. Things can get over a little bit easier. And then they show you a sphere with a fairing on the front of it. Now you're getting somewhere. You're creating a spearing point that's going to split the air and allow it to go over it. And then when you add a sphere inside of a housing, or when you're talking about an airfoil, now you're creating a nice smooth surface that creates a nice, what they call a laminar flow, allowing the air to move over it nice and smooth and continue back with it on the trailing edge. And it shows turbulence basically on these four types of form drag that they're showing you, and you can see how it's reducing as the little vortexes are getting less and less as you from a block to a sphere with a fairing to basically an airfoil. So, and then that's what consists of form drag. So skin friction is going to be kind of what it seems to sound like. If you have an airfoil that's really rough and really porous, you're going to get kind of a disrupt flow over that, so that's going to create drag. Even a really smooth painted surface is going to have little eddies in it and not be as smooth. I mean, even the smoothest thing in the world is not perfectly smooth, except for like those things that spiders can't crawl out of, which is great. So that's what helps me remember that. So skin friction is just going to be just like what it sounds like, the skin of the airfoil, the skin of the helicopter, all of that. So now induced drag is the byproduct of the production of lift. So byproduct of the creation of lift. This is actually the only form of drag that actually reduces as you move forward into flight. And that's due to what we're going to talk about here next, which is called induced flow. Now that, we'll go into that and describe how that's going to change here in just a second. But just so you understand that induced drag is the byproduct of the creation of lift. So, and is the only form of drag that actually decreases with forward airspeed. Now parasite drag is my favorite because it's the easiest one to remember because it is anything that's not helping the helicopter fly. So the mast, landing gear, antennas, the overall shape of the helicopter, if it doesn't, isn't very formed to that. So Parasite drag is any body part not creating lift. Not creating lift. And then you have, at the end of all this, total drag. And that's what we're going to jump into next, is the drag curve. And that, I've got to erase the board, so remember that profile drag is the sum of form drag and skin friction combined, where induced drag is a byproduct of the creation of lift and reduces as forward airspeed increases. Parasite drag is any body part not creating lift. So landing gear, antennas, the mast that's covering everything. And I have now misplaced my dryer here. There we go. So if you look on page 2-6, there is the the combined forces of all these drags working against each other. So what I should have done is wrote those in different colors so that this would make sense when I did this, but I'll remember that for next time. So if you were going to go with draw this graph here first. So parasite drag is going to be one of those things, and we're going to do it in purple. It's going to kind of start at about 25 and exponentially grow. So this is going to be parasite. It's a little bit easier to draw down here. Next we're going to draw profile drag. Remember, profile drag is, this is where you would more likely answer, is the profile drag and skin friction combined. So that's going to start basically, 10-15 miles an hour, and it's going to climb up here like this, and this is going to be profile. And this is going to vary with every helicopter, but this is just a basic example of what you're dealing with. The next one we're going to do is induced drag. I draw this way because it's, we're going to get red. I draw it this way because this is a better explanation for when we move on and we're going to talk about how this is all going to change. It's going to start at here and then just slowly dissipate like that. And this is induced. And the reason why I draw it back here is because this is a speed which a lot of things are going to start to change with the rotor disc and how the air is moving through it, and that's what we're going to move into next to kind of correlate induced drag with this next thing called transverse flow. Induced flow, which is going to dictate how much induced drag there is. So, and then if you were to look at the sum of all these, which is called total drag, they're going to be up here. That's what total drag is going to look like. Now you notice that at about 53 knots, you see the total drag, all the sums together, are the lowest. That's what's dictating your, if you've been reading your POH, is your VY speed. So 53 knots is for the 22, the R22, is the best climb out speed, because that's when your thrust to drag ratio is the best. And then this helps tell you where your best range speed is as well, but for this example we're just going to show you that obviously at the low bottom of the curve is where your best thrust to weight ratio is. So bless you. Next thing we're going to talk about is induced flow, or the downwash of the rotor system. Alright, so now we're going to talk about induced flow, or downwash. So induced flow is what is happening at all times for a flight, or in a hover. And what it is this is caused by a pitch change in the rotor, which draws air down through the rotor disc, thus creating the downwash. And this is important to us because this is actually where induced flow starts with induced drag. Is once it is created, that is where induced drag is coming from. So if we were to draw an airfoil, with a little bit more aggressive of a flight path, you got that. I'm just going to draw the bits in here so we can see everything. So you've got your cord line down here going through the airfoil. And you've got, let's say this is your rotational relative wind. So at a hover, obviously your blade's just spinning on the axis of the horizon. So normally, lift is always going to be perpendicular to relative wind, or rotational relative wind. So normally you would have lift reacting straight up. But because of induced flow, excuse me, because you've got induced flow of the air coming straight down through the rotor system, that changes your angle of attack from being, bring the blue pen back, sorry, I was getting a text from my instructor. So normally you would have, let's say that's where it is. This would be your angle of attack in a perfect world with no induced flow. That's great. You know, we'll draw a little bit. Draw that here so it's a little more dramatic. So, but because induced flow and the airflow is coming more from the top, you've got, you know, your airflow is coming down into the rotor disc. You get more of a resultant relative wind, basically, when you combine induced flow and rotational relative wind, of something more like this. So you basically are losing, you know, let's say 5 degrees of angle of attack. And therefore, you've got to look at Now your lift is going like this. This is induced drag. The difference of these two right here, of where it should be and where it is. You could say that this is induced drag. Now obviously as you, I gotta stop saying obviously. Now as you move forward in airspeed and reduce some of the induced flow coming straight down and more horizontally across the disc, which we'll talk about in a minute, this is going to move forward, reducing your induced drag. Like we said, as you move forward in airspeed, your induced drag and induced flow lessen, and therefore you get a greater angle of attack for a given pitch, which is what you want. So that is your induced flow or downwash. And you can look this up on page 2-10 of the Helicopter Flying Handbook, where it talks about it. And it talks about it as well later on in the book when we were talking about, where'd she go? On 2-21. So you can see this on chapter 2, page 10, as well as 2-21. It talks about it twice because it's happening in the same type of phase of flight, but it needs to be described in two separate locations because one is dealing with induced drag and one is dealing with translational lift and transverse flow. So things to remember here are, as induced flow is reduced, induced drag is reduced. But as induced flow is increased, induced drag is increased, because you're no longer getting a straight up lift vertical or lift vector. You're getting more of an angled one. So it's not creating the same amount of lift, as well as you're losing your angle of attack the more induced flow you have. So we're going to cover this at the end of the lesson, so hopefully you're taking notes. So now that we've covered basically the necessary evils of the four forces of flight, we're going to go into the actions that are happening during all of this. And so we're going to start from a pickup from a hover and the things that are happening. So we're going to talk about torque effect, and translating tendency. So let's say we're looking at the helicopter from the top, and for our case we have our rotor blades are rotating this way. So they're also hooked to the helicopter. So when we talked about Newton's third law back then, we were talking about aerodynamics. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Well, that also applies here. So now, because the rotor blades are spinning counterclockwise, the thing that they're attached to, the fuselage, wants to spin clockwise. This is the torque effect. So now you've got the fuselage wanting to go this way, wanting to go clockwise. So, as I'm sure you can guess, and if you can't, that's just fine. That's what your anti-torque system is for. As we talked about earlier in a previous lesson, we would have talked about the rotor system and the anti-torque system and how they kind of work together. Now, so to counteract the torque on the fuselage, you have a tail rotor, which is pulling the tail to the right. Or that's the way thrust is pushing the tail. So you've got thrust coming out of here. So now the torque is counteracted with this, but you've still got all this thrust pushing going this way. So because you've got thrust going this way, Newton's third law is still coming into effect. And that is translating tendency, is the thrust from the tail rotor is pushing the helicopter in this direction, or to the right. This, what we're going to call this, the T2, the translating tendency. So this is going to happen every time you pick up if you don't compensate for it. At least it is in the 22. And how it's compensated for are 3 ways. There is rigged mass, rigged controls, and then pilot induced. You're going to want to remember these because you're going to be asked these in check rides, in a test. This is a test question, translating tendency, the movement of the helicopter due to the tail rotor thrust. So, remember, torque effect is the effect that the fuselage wants to turn to the right because the rotors are turning to the left. That's compensated for by the anti-torque system. But then all the thrust from the anti-torque system is pushing the helicopter to the right because thrust is going to the left, or the downwash is going to the left from the tail rotor, so therefore the helicopter drifts to the right. And you compensate for that in the 22 by, you know, a little slide to the left cyclic as you're picking up. Next, we're going to talk about the Pendulum Action. So for me, this was the first thing that I saw when, so I'm open the board here to get it a little more stable. I saw this first when I saw a EMS helicopter land on the street to pick up a person that was involved in a pretty bad accident in a car. And when he picked up the helicopter and, you know, started pulling collective, the blades started to, oh my goodness, I'm totally talking about the wrong thing. Pendulum Action, I'll have to delete that out. So with Pendulum Action, is defined as any relatively any object with considerable mass suspended from a single point is free to oscillate. Now for us, this is becomes prevalent when you're first a new student and you go out to hover practice and you start, you know, putting in inputs and the helicopter starts rocking back and forth and swinging back and forward, and it's just like a pendulum. You've got this single point and it's free to kind of just move about, and this is very aggravated when you over control the helicopter. So that's why we bring this up, is to remind you that the helicopter is mounted from the single point, or from the mast, you know, from where the rotor hub meets the mast is a single point, so it's free to kind of dance around. So bring that up so that keep an idea in your mind that you can't over control the helicopter. You start rocking around. Your instructor might tease you that you're putting them to sleep because you're rocking them back and forth like a little baby. So next is going to be coning. Now coning is similar to what I mean, for me, for what it sounds, is when the rotor blades start to have a conical path. And what that is resulting is if you look at a mast here with some blades on it, you've got two things acting on them once they start to spin. You've got an outward force, or the centrifugal force, and you've got lift from when you change the pitch on with the collective, and the angle of attack changes, and we went over all that, so you got lift. This is, for me, an idea. First, centrifugal force is, you can think of it as a merry-go-round when you were a kid and you had your buddy out there grabbing that thing and spinning as fast as he could, and you're out there and you're holding on and it's pulling you to the outside. Well, that's what's happening to the blades, is they're being pulled outwards, and that's actually what gives them a lot of their strength. Then when you have lift acting on that, the blades start to bend. So they start to kind of have a changed upward path, similar to that. And maybe not as drastic as that, but for an example, just to show you. And this is called the resultant blade angle. So that's what's happening in coning. This is going to be really prevalent in helicopters with big rotor systems. It happens in all helicopters, but you can see it a lot with big helicopters that can lift a lot of weight. EMS helicopters, I saw, a couple of EMS helicopters. There's a couple good links on YouTube. If you just type in helicopter blades coning, you can see a ton of it. So it's really cool to watch. You're going to see it right as a pilot, after he spins up and the helicopter is at full speed, or the rotor system is at full speed. You'll see it as, right as he changes pitches, the blades will turn upwards. And they'll stay that way as the helicopter lifts off the ground and moves into forward flight. And they'll stay that way the entire time until there's no more lift being produced on the rotor system. So remember, you've got two things that are acting on them that result in one. So you've got lift and centrifugal forces, which result in resultant blade angle, or coning. So next is gyroscopic procession. Make sure I spell this right. Recession. And it basically states that a force applied to a spinning object will have a maximum effect 90 degrees later in rotation. So force applied on a spinning object. We'll have maximum effect 90 degrees later in rotation. This for us makes sense and is brought into helicopters is because if you were looking at a rotor system, I'm going to draw this in two halves. If you were to go forward cyclic on the helicopter, so if you were to take your little cyclic and however you want to make it look with your little hand here and move it forward, the pitch change is going to happen actually 90 degrees before it's intended to. So it's going to happen right here. And then 90 degrees later, 90 degree angle, it's going to happen right here. So that's going to change the angle of attack. It's going to start here and have its maximum deflection right here. So therefore the helicopter is going to move forward. This was applied the whole way around the rotor disc, and this is all just dependent on where you're putting the cyclic. But let's say you want to go to the left. You're going to, when you apply left cyclic, the action is going to happen after the disc and have its maximum deflection at the right, pulling the blade up, or if you want to look at the exact opposite way, it pitches down here and pitches down here, allowing the helicopter to dip to the left. This is, we have in our classroom, we have a wheel, like a BMX wheel that is on a handle, and you can spin it. And then when you flick your wrist forward, the thing dips to the left, almost 90 degrees to the left. And that is gyroscopic recession. This is compensated for, similar to the translating tendency way of handling things. But it is actually, the controls are rigged rigged 90 degrees 90 degrees back, or phase lag. So normally if you were to, without the 90 degrees up, if you were to go forward on the cyclic, you would you'd roll to the left, because that's where your input would happen. But instead, so when you go forward on the cyclic, it actually makes the input happen over on the left hand side, so its maximum deflection is in the back of the disc. So make sure you've taken notes on this. We're going to go back over this. A good example is, like I said, the wheel, the spinning wheel on that axis, and you flick it and it goes 90 degrees off of where you intended to put the input. So remember, gyroscopic recession is a force applied to a spinning object will have its maximum effect 90 degrees later in rotation. That can also be looked at on page 16 of chapter 2. It discusses that. Now we're going to talk about blade flapping, and then that's going to lead us into Symmetry of Lift and retreating blade stall. So when we talked about rotor systems, we talked about their flapping hinges and all, and that's where this comes into play. So if you've got a helicopter hub and it's mast, you've got, for us, a two-bladed system, they're allowed to flap up and down as a pair on the flapping hinge right here. And they're going to flap together, so kind of like a seesaw. And so what that helps with is helps to counteract a problem with the symmetry of lift. So when you're talking about this, and let's say we're looking at this from an aerial view, got your little helicopter here, and we're talking about in forward flight. So you've got so if we're talking about in forward flight, and this is what brings up this problem of the symmetry of lift. So you've got a forward airspeed of 100 knots and a rotor speed of 400 knots. The air coming in to the rotor system is going to be 500 knots, because you're going to combine the two. But the exact opposite is going to happen on this side. So now you've still got, now you're going to be 300 knots striking the backside, or 300 knots of air going over the retreating blade. And when we talked about relative wind and how that's all working, if you've got, so when this happens, you've got to, things are going to change. So with the flapping, when we were talking about how they flap together in unison, so one goes up, one goes down, that's what's going to happen basically right here in forward flight. And we're going to talk about basically the right and the left side of the rotor disc. So if you were to look at this as we're going to look at chord lines here. And let's say rotational relative wind. Resultant relative wind is coming at this angle. You can see normally they would have the same angle of attack, but when a blade flaps up, it changes the direction of where the air is actually traveling. And so when you get an up flap in the blade, which is what's going to happen when it advances, it's going to up flap, and it's actually going to cut and change basically the the resultant relative wind. So therefore, your angle of attack is going to be lessened. So you're not going to get as much lift over on the right-hand side. But that's okay, because it's enough. But what happens when a blade flaps down is it creates a greater relative wind. So therefore, you get much more lift for that given pitch angle because of the angle of attack. And the reason why this needs to happen is because you're getting so much more lift because the air coming into the rotor system on the right hand side is, let's say it's 500 knots, but when it retreats it's at 300, and this just gets worse and worse as the airspeed increases and increases. So if you just keep going faster and faster in a world where this didn't happen sooner, this could get all the way down to zero. You know, if you were going 400 miles an hour forward and the blade was going at, you'd have an 800 mile an hour wind coming in here, but then again you would have zero wind coming into this side, and therefore the helicopter would roll to the left and you would crash because you would no longer be creating lift on the left hand side of the rotor disc. So the symmetry of lift is compensated for with blade flapping, and it only can go so far. I mean, the helicopter blade can only flap up and down so far, and when you reach those maximum limits, the helicopter basically starts to will start to roll to the left, and that brings up another hazard that we'll go over when we come back to this. But so the symmetry of lift is compensated for by blade flapping, and it basically is the up and down flap of the blades in the rotational path of the rotor system. So you can remember that when you flap the blade up, it doesn't have the same angle of attack. It lessens the angle of attack, and then when it flaps down, it increases the angle of attack to compensate for the lack of airflow coming into the rotor disc. Okay. So transverse flow. Transverse flow effect. Next definition of this is the tendency for the helicopter to roll to the right or the advancing side as it accelerates approximately to 20 knots. So you can also call this the induced roll. So the tendency the way you can look at this is when we're talking about gyroscopic recession is when you move forward and you start to move forward through air, through the air. You've got your helicopter, let's say she's flying like this, you got your rotors like this. Let me draw a forward portion of the Alright, so with transverse flow, you've got as your helicopter starts to move forward, you're going to reduce the induced flow. So the air is going to transverse over the top of the rotor disc and into the back part of the rotor disc. Now the reason why you talk about this is because if we're looking at blue is going to be our airflow. You're going from having air coming down through the rotor disc and creating these little tip vortices to these tip vortices lessening up front, and the air is going to start flowing like this through the rotor disc. So if you were to look at this from a top view, you're going to have tip vortices kind of all around here, but the front part of the disc is going to be fairly undisturbed, and so it's going to be getting I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought here. So as you move forward here, you're flying into relatively undisturbed air. And we're going to kind of draw that in red so that it's more prevalent. So this whole portion of the disc right here is in clean relative air, and because of gyroscopic precession, the lift that it's going to create right here is going to obviously turn 90 degrees to the left, because that's the rotation of the rotor system, and it's going to cause the helicopter to roll to the right. And this is kind of prevalent if you've been paying attention in your flights, that the helicopter, as you move through what we're going to talk about next is translational lift and effective translational lift, is you actually have to go right cyclic, or left cyclic, I'm sorry, or left cyclic to compensate for this, because you're actually running into more clean air, so you actually have to produce more lift on the right hand side of the helicopter. So like I was saying, is as you move forward through this and your front of your helicopter rotor system becomes more efficient, the helicopter is going to have a tendency to roll to the right, because you're still not getting the same amount of lift on the right hand rotor disc as you were because of gyroscopic precession. So the blade up front, because it's got this big clean air, it's going to have its maximum effect 90 degrees later in rotation, so therefore it's going to roll the helicopter to the right. So that's what's happening here. They also call this the basically inflow roll is another little example of it. So that's talking about transverse flow. Now, when you talk about translational lift, translational lift is increased lift without a change in collective position due to horizontal airflow. So it's the same idea that we're talking about transverse flow, we're going to talk about translational lift. So we talk about translating lift, and effective translating lift. So translating lift is a, like I said, increased lift without a collective pitch change into horizontal airflow through the disc. And by this, we're going to draw a couple helicopters here. We'll have one here in a hover. And then we're going to have one here moving into forward flight. Now with this, we're going to talk about vortices. I'm going to draw vortices in red. So if we were going to talk about airflow, we're talking about in a hover, airflow, like we were saying earlier, or induced flow, is coming from the top through the rotor disc and down, and it's kind of being recirculated along the tips, creating these little vortices on the tips. So when you move into forward air flight, the air is now starting to come like this. And it's still coming down, so you still get a little tip vortices back here, but not a ton. And then when you move into forward flight above, one more helicopter here first. You move forward into forward flight, you're talking about airflows like this. You've lost your tip vortices, other than the ones that are going to be trailing off just the left and right of the helicopter, if you're in forward flight, mind you. And the speeds that these are going to happen at is 0 KIS, or now it's indicated airspeed. This is 1 to 5. And then this is basically greater than 16 to 24 KIS. So this is what you would consider translational lift. And this is ELT, or ETL, I'm sorry, effective translational lift. So we talk about these kind of I talk about them in pairs because ETL happens, they say in the book, at 16 to 24 knots. Effective translational lift, basically when you've blown all the vortices off the forward and aft part of the disc and they're just on the trailing edges on the left and right hand side. Whereas translational lift is when you've just first started to move forward and the airflow has gone from being vertical to horizontal, starting to go horizontal to the forward part of the rotor disc, or if that's what direction you're having. Translational lift actually can happen in a light wind condition. If you had a 1 to 5 knot headwind, you're going to start to get translational lift. You're already going to have sort of a more clean rotor system. Whereas if you have a nice heavy wind like 16 to 24 knots, you're already in ETL. The second you pick up, your whole system has become efficient. So lastly, we're going to talk about retreating blade stall. So with retreating blade stall, and this this is defined as a tendency for the retreating blade to stall at high forward airspeeds. This in turn limits the forward airspeed of the helicopter. So tendency for retreating blade to stall from high forward airspeed. Now this is, when we're talking about retreating blades, we're talking about for us would be the left-hand side of the disc. So that's the blade that's going to be retreating, and it's going to have a mixture of its own retreating speed mixed in with the forward airspeed of the helicopter. For us it's 102 knots, and that's what your VNE is in your handbook. So it's 102 knots. This is V and E, or your never exceed speed. So what's happening with your rotor? So at a normal, we'll say that's normal pitch, or forward air pitch, and then as the blade flaps and is trying to compensate for this into symmetry of lift, the angle gets more and more aggressive to the point where it stalls. And so we were looking at chord lines, and you were looking at airflow that comes behind it. Airflow is going to be coming over and underneath and kind of meeting up back here in the back. As you increase this airflow, the airflow's got to come up and then it meets back here. So you're getting this big negative void where you're not creating lift, or you're creating too big of a gap for your high and low pressures, and it gets super aggravated. This comes back here and just trails and turns into turbulence. So this is what's going to happen when you go too far with forward airspeed, is the blade's got to continually keep, getting a greater angle of attack, and gets more and more and more. And as if you're looking at this, and if you're doing the demonstration of the hand out the window, and you stick your hand out the window, and you get this controlled movement of your hand going up, and then you do this, and it moves up faster and faster, and then when you get too far back, your hand just slams the back of the window seal. And that's basically what's happening. Excuse the noise. It's so much that the blade just can't keep up, and the blade actually stalls and stops producing lift. Your hand is no longer, if you're looking at the hand model, your hand is no longer pulling your hand up, it's pulling your hand back. And that's exactly what's happening, is it's stalling out. It doesn't want to go through the cycle anymore, and this can aggravate so much that eventually the whole rotor system will stall. But I'll draw you a kind of another picture of this. Of what's happening on the disc. I'm going to remove that explanation for you. Because if you were looking at the rotor disc, your center hub and your helicopter and your blades, you've got your advancing side over here, and then you've got your retreating side here. So let's say at 102 knots, into it's 102, so that's your VNE, you're going to get this huge stalled region, and it gets bigger and bigger as the speed goes up. And that, you can basically look at it as now, that's how much of your rotor blade is creating lift compared to the other side. So you can see you're getting much more lift, and what's going to happen here is first you're going to get vibrations. Then you're going to get, your nose is going to pitch up because you're getting a much more effective blade here. So and up through the front here. So you're going to get this pitch up of the blade, or the pitch up of the nose. Then you're going to get a left roll, obviously, because, again, I shouldn't say obviously, but because you can see here that the left side of your rotor disc is no longer producing as much lift as the right, you're going to roll to the left. And the recovery for this, so we're going to do signs. The recovery is to lower collective, so take the pitch away from both sides. And go aft on the cyclic. So yes, the nose is already coming up, but you're going to slow down the forward airspeed of the helicopter, so aft cyclic. So that sums up the aerodynamics of flight. Just to go back over what we covered, we talked about the 4 forces of flight, so lift, weight, drag, and thrust. We talked about how lift is created with Bernoulli's principle and angle of attack. Then we talked about airfoils, how the chord line goes from the trailing edge, or the leading edge to the trailing edge. And then after talking about those, we talked about types of airfoils. We moved into drag, the types of drag. So you've got profile, induced, and parasite. Profile being a combination of form and skin friction. Induced drag being the result of creating lift and how it lessens as you move forward into forward airspeed. And then parasite drag, which is another one that climbs as you go forward faster, because you're talking about components like your gear, your mast, your antennas, all of that creating resistance to the airflow. We moved on from there to talk about, we talked about relative wind and angle of attack, and we were talking about lift and how lift is created. Then we went into the torque effect. So the fuselage's natural tendency, because of Newton's third law, to go in the opposite direction of the rotor. So you've got blades going this way, fuselage must go this way. The anti-torque takes care of the fuselage and brings it straight and level. And then you've got that leftover airflow blowing off to the left-hand side of the helicopter, which causes your translating tendency to move the helicopter to the right. You've got the Pendulum Action. Remember, that is any object with a considerable mass connected from a single point is free to oscillate. Then we talked about coning with the helicopter, with lift and centrifugal forces acting together creates the conical path of the rotor blades as it creates lift. Gyroscopic Recession, that was the force applied to a rotating object will have its maximum effect 90 degrees later. Then we talked about blade flapping and how that compensates for the symmetry of lift. And then we talked about translational lift and effective translational lift, as well as talking about transverse flow, or as we call the inflow roll, due to the clean air up front of the rotor disc, and then that maximum effect happening 90 degrees later, making the helicopter roll to the right. Then we finished it all off with a retreating blade stall discussion, and the things that are going to happen when you see that. Like I said, vibration, pitch up of the nose, will roll to the left, and then the recovery would be a lower the collective and acyclic. This is my aerodynamics lesson. I'm still trying to brush it up, just trying to keep the verbiage going. Trying to keep it under a 2-hour lesson. I know it's probably supposed to be a lot less than that, but it's about usually what we do for ground. So please, like I said in the beginning, leave me comments, critiques. I'm open to them all as long as you're not a D-bag and tell me that I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm talking about. If that's the case, then that's the case, but hopefully you're not that man. So if there's anything that I can improve on, please let me know. I greatly appreciate it. And thanks for watching, guys.